Hi, my name is Nathan. You're watching Nice at Dice, and today I am talking about a game called Pandemic Hot Zone North America. Now, you may have heard of a game called Pandemic before. It's a very popular cooperative board game that's been out for many years at this point. This is the latest variation on that game. It's streamlined, it's slimmed down, it's made simpler so that it's more approachable for new players and can be played in a shorter period of time. Now, perhaps you are not familiar with Pandemic and you have no idea what this game is going to be like, so I will explain that to you. And perhaps you're thinking, is this something that you should be interested in if you are already a veteran of Pandemic? So I'm going to talk about that as well. So to get started with, I'm going to show you how the game works, and then I'll come back and give you my thoughts on it. So I have here a game of Pandemic Hot Zone North America set up for 3 players. As you can see, you have a central board here where most of the action takes place, and I have sort of simulated 3 different player hands. Each player is going to get a roll card like this. It gives you 1 or 2 special abilities, and you're going to have a couple of player cards at the beginning of the game. Most of the player cards are representing cities that are on the board, and they are important for their location and also for the color of the card. And I'll explain what you do with those in a little bit. But first of all, just to kind of give you a sense of what's going on in the game, you have this map of North America with different cities marked on the map. You have lines between the cities indicating how your character can travel between the cities. You have these brightly colored cubes that start out on some of the cities and will get added to cities as the game progresses. These cubes represent the presence of 3 different diseases on the map. And the goal of the game is to cure all 3 diseases before one of a few different bad things can happen. So, what do you do on your turn? Well, on your turn you get 4 actions, and you can use those actions to do a variety of things. For one, you can move from one city to another, so you can simply move your pawn along any of these white lines to a connected city. So moving from one city to another is an action. You can also fly from one city to another. So for example, if I was in Santo Domingo and this particular player has the card for Santo Domingo, he can discard that card to fly from Santo Domingo to any other city he wants, maybe Calgary, for example. He also happens to have this blue card for Calgary, so he could be on any city, and for an action he could discard that. Oh, I'm sorry, this was for Chicago. So he could discard that to fly directly to Chicago. So that's another thing you can do for an action. You can also treat diseases. So if you are in a city with some of these disease cubes, for one action you can remove 1 cube and return it to the supply. You can also share knowledge. So for example, this person has the card for Washington, so if they were on Washington and this player was also on Washington, for one action, this player who has the card could give it to the player who didn't have the card, or alternatively, if it was the other player's turn, they could take it from the player who has it, with their permission, of course. If you happen to have 4 cards of the same color, like let's say we got all 4 of these blue cards into this player's hand, and that player was in Atlanta, they could use an action to basically discard those 4 cards and cure the blue disease. And we'd move this marker up there to indicate that the blue disease has been cured. Once we've cured the other 2 diseases, we've won the game. However, you can also lose the game. There are a few ways that can happen. One is if this deck of player cards is ever fully depleted, then you lose the game. If you have to add cubes of a certain color to the board, but there are no more in the supply, then you will lose the game. Or if this track gets all the way to the bottom, then you lose the game. So, how does this marker move on the track? Well, that is about outbreaks, and so the way outbreaks happen is, for example, in San Francisco here, we have 3 red cubes. If we ever needed to add a 4th cube, instead of adding a 4th cube there, we would have an outbreak. So we'd move this down 1, and we would add a red cube to each connected city. and if that happens too many times, then we'll lose the game. So those are the 3 ways you can lose the game. That's how you win the game. That's basically what you do on your turn. However, after resolving your 4 actions, moving around, removing disease cubes, swapping cards, maybe using those cards to cure a disease, then you have to draw 2 cards from this deck, which will get you some more options in your hand, and then you have to resolve the infection step. So in the beginning of the game, you resolve the infection step by simply drawing 2 cards from this deck and then adding 1 cube to each of those cities. So we had Montreal there, and we had Guadalajara down there. So we'd add cubes to those that get discarded, and that would be your turn, basically. You did your 4 actions, you drew 2 cards from here, you drew 2 cards from here. However, as you go through this deck, you're going to find a couple of other types of cards. The one that you're definitely going to see is an epidemic. When you draw an epidemic, you have to increase this marker here to the next step. And what that does is when you have it here, you draw 2 cards from this during the infection. In the second spot, it's still 2 cards, but once you get to the third spot, it's now 3 cards. And there it is 4 cards. So as these epidemics come out, the number of cities that get infected at the end of each turn will increase. The second thing you do when an epidemic comes out is you have to take 1 card from the bottom of this deck. So it will be a card you haven't yet seen in the game. You're going to flip it over, and you're going to add 3 cubes to that city. So that's the next thing you're going to do. Then you're going to discard that card. You're going to pick up all the cards you've discarded from that spot. You're going to shuffle them up, much better than what I am doing right now. And you're going to put them back on top of the deck. So now you're going to be going through those same cities again, making it much more likely that you'll be adding more cubes to cities that already have cubes, making it much more likely you'll have outbreaks, and much more likely you'll lose the game. So there's always 3 of these epidemic cards in the player deck, and that's what happens when those come out. The other type of card that may be in this deck are called crisis cards. They all have negative effects that happen when they get drawn. Some of them, like this one, says reduce player's hand size to 5 cards. So when this card comes out, your hand size is no longer 6 cards maximum, but now it's 5 cards maximum. And this card will remain in play next to the board until another crisis comes out to replace it. Some of the crisis cards, like for example, this one gets resolved immediately and then discarded. So this one actually moves this up 1 on that track, and then it gets discarded. So those are the crisis cards. You can set up the game with either 0, 3, or 6 crisis cards in the player deck, depending on how difficult you want the game to be. And I should also mention that there are some other good cards in this deck. There are 4 of these event cards, and they just go in the player's hand and can be used whenever. They don't require an action to use. They can be used on any player's turn, and they are always something positive. Like this one just lets you pick up a pawn and move it to any city on the board without using an action. So those are basically the rules of the game, how it works. Gives you a good idea of what's involved in the game. We'll go back up and I will give you my thoughts on it. Alright, so hopefully that gives you a good overview of how the game works. One thing I sort of alluded to, but I didn't really explain, was how each player has a character card that gives you a specific role, and that comes with some special abilities. So I just wanted to address that real quickly. The 4 roles that you have in the game are the dispatcher, the medic, the generalist, and the researcher. The dispatcher can basically move other people around on the board on their turn, so it can help you set up other players for their turns. The medic is more effective at curing diseases, of basically taking those cubes off of the board. He can do it more efficiently, more effectively. The generalist just has 5 actions on her turn instead of 4. And the researcher lets you give any card from your hand to another player. It doesn't have to be on a matching city. So those are the 4 abilities. They're all pretty simple, straightforward, but they give you something a little bit extra that you're good at, more so than the other characters. So that's a nice aspect of the game. So my overall impression of the game for people who have not played any version of Pandemic is that this is an excellent game. I like how the game is approachable. You can learn the rules in a very short amount of time. It's quick to set up. It's easy to set up. It's easy to learn what you do on your turn. The game itself takes maybe 20 to 40 minutes to play, so it has a relatively short play time. So I like that about it. I like that you're all cooperating and you're all working together to accomplish this shared goal, and I think that's really fun. Overall, the game is pretty simple, but the strategies are somewhat nuanced because you have multiple things you're trying to sort of balance. You have your main goal of curing those diseases, but you also have to make sure that you don't get too many cubes on the board to where you run out of cubes in the supply. That could be a way that you lose. You have to make sure that you don't waste too much time trying to contain the diseases and then burn through that player deck before you've got all your cures. You also have to make sure that you don't allow cubes to build up on one city and cause an outbreak and then lose due to the outbreak. So there's just a lot of different things there that you have to that you have to juggle, you have to balance, you have to really divide your attention between these different aspects of the game, and that makes for a really fun and interesting challenge. Lots of opportunities for cooperation. I think the only drawback to Pandemic in general, and it's true in this version of Pandemic as well, is that because all of the information is basically known to every player, there is a tendency for players to kind of play other people's turns, so to speak. To just sort of look at the situation and be like, oh, you should go here and do this and do that, and that should be your turn. And it's kind of like, if they're right, you can't really, argue with that, and then somebody else basically just played your turn. But I think that's more a problem with players, and it's just players need to kind of rein themselves in and not be too overbearing with telling other people how to play their turns. But it is something that is going to pop up with certain groups or with certain players in this game, just like any other version of Pandemic. Now, if you are a veteran of Pandemic coming to this game, what you probably should know is that it is streamlined. You only have the 3 diseases instead of 4. You only need 4 cards to cure a disease instead of 5. Technically, you only need 4 instead of 6, because in a normal version of Pandemic, you also have to build a research station in that region and then go there and do that, so it's like a whole other step, and it requires another card of that color. So it's considerably streamlined. There are fewer roles. The roles that are there are probably the simpler roles. The biggest pro, I think, for this over base Pandemic, apart from the fact that just the biggest pro overall is the way you set up with 3 epidemics, and then if you want to make it more challenging, you add those crisis cards. I think that's really neat. To me, it's just a simpler thing to say you always split the deck into 3 parts, add in those epidemics, and then if you want to, you can add 1 or 2 of those crisis cards into each of those 3 stacks, rather than doing the whole thing where it's like, if you want more difficulty, you add more epidemics, you split the deck into more piles to put those epidemics in. It's just more work, more shuffling, more splitting things up, and so this way of adjusting the difficulty just seems more streamlined, much simpler, much quicker to set the game up. So I like that a lot. As far as the challenge of the game, it is overall a simpler game, but not necessarily an easier game. So if you're concerned about that, I played it multiple times with a couple of other players who, all 3 of us have played a lot of different versions of Pandemic multiple times, and we went straight to the hardest difficulty setting, and we played it like we had to play it 3 times before we could get a win. So I feel like it is fairly challenging even for experienced players. So there is that. Don't feel like this is necessarily the easy mode of the game. It can still be fairly challenging for veterans if you want it to be. So overall, I like it. I like that it's got that shorter play time, it's simpler, it's streamlined. The only thing that I miss really is with the roll cards. I think only having 4, I'm going to get a little bit bored with that after a while. It would be nice to have more role cards. But again, if you're really a veteran of Pandemic and you're familiar with all the different roles out there, it would probably be fairly easy to figure out how some of those roles could very easily just be slotted into this game. And then you can either proxy those cards, or you can just agree that, like, okay, everybody knows what the quarantine specialist does. I'm going to be the quarantine specialist, in this game, or however you want to approach it. But there's ways around it, is what I'm saying. But to me, that's the biggest drawback of this version of the game. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Definitely recommend it if you have not played Pandemic. This is a good one to start with. If you are a veteran of Pandemic, I think this still has something to offer as sort of a more streamlined, faster version of the game. Maybe a good game to introduce new players. Or if you just have a limited play time and you want to get in a game of Pandemic. Anyway, my name is Nathan. You've been watching Nice at Dice. Thank you so much for watching, and you enjoy the rest of your day.